The morning sun cast long shadows across downtown Atlanta as Detective Marcus Rodriguez pulled his patrol car to the curb outside Mercy General Hospital. The radio had been crackling with bizarre reports all night: violent attacks, unexplained injuries, and witnesses describing assailants who seemed impervious to pain. Marcus had seen plenty in his 15 years on the force, but something about these calls felt different. The dispatch operator's voice had carried an edge of fear that made his stomach tighten with unease. Dr. Emily Watson rushed through the emergency room doors, her scrubs already stained with blood from the night shift that had stretched well into the morning. She had been working at Mercy General for 8 years, but the past 12 hours had tested every limit of her medical training. The patients arriving weren't responding to standard treatment protocols. Their wounds were severe, often appearing to be human bite marks, and their vital signs were erratic in ways that defied medical explanation. What disturbed her most was the way some patients had become increasingly agitated, their eyes taking on a vacant, predatory quality that made the nursing staff uncomfortable. Across town, construction foreman Jake Thompson was trying to maintain order at his job site near the city's industrial district. 3 of his workers had called in sick with what they described as a violent flu, and 2 others had simply vanished without explanation. The remaining crew was on edge, jumping at every unexpected sound. Jake had noticed strange movements in the abandoned warehouse across the street, shadows that didn't belong and sounds that seemed almost animalistic. His instincts, honed by years of working in rough neighborhoods, were screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. Meanwhile, at the Centers for Disease Control headquarters just outside the city, Dr. Michael Chen was staring at laboratory results that made no scientific sense. The blood samples from recent attack victims contained an unknown pathogen that appeared to be rewriting cellular structure at an unprecedented rate. The organism was unlike anything in their databases, showing characteristics of both viral and parasitic infections while displaying an aggressive mutation pattern that seemed almost intelligent in its adaptation. His colleague, Dr. Sarah Williams, had been working alongside him through the night, and both scientists were beginning to suspect they were looking at something that could fundamentally alter human biology. The first major incident occurred at Riverside Elementary School when teacher Jennifer Martinez noticed that several students who had been absent the previous day had returned looking pale and disoriented. During morning recess, one of these children, normally gentle and well-behaved, suddenly attacked a classmate with shocking violence. The attack was swift and brutal, with the aggressor showing no response to pain when other teachers tried to intervene. Jennifer managed to pull the children apart, but not before witnessing something that would haunt her dreams. The attacking child's eyes were completely vacant, as if no human consciousness remained behind them. As news of the school incident spread through emergency channels, Marcus found himself responding to increasingly violent calls throughout the city. Each scene presented the same disturbing pattern: attackers who seemed to feel no pain, victims with severe bite wounds, and witnesses describing behavior that seemed more animal than human. The attackers were being subdued only through overwhelming force, and even then they continued struggling with inhuman persistence until physically incapacitated. Dr. Watson's emergency room was becoming overwhelmed as more victims arrived throughout the day. The hospital's security team had been forced to restrain several patients who had become violent without warning. These individuals showed no recognition of family members or medical staff, responding only with aggressive attempts to bite anyone who came within reach. The hospital's isolation protocols were being pushed to their limits as the medical staff struggled to understand what they were dealing with. By afternoon, Jake's construction site had become a fortress of sorts. The crew had barricaded themselves in the main office trailer after witnessing their missing co-workers emerge from the abandoned warehouse across the street. But these weren't the men Jake had known for years. They moved with a shambling, unnatural gait and showed no recognition when called by name. When the crew tried to approach them, the transformed workers attacked with savage intensity, forcing Jake and his team to retreat and call for help. The CDC team was working frantically to understand the pathogen's transmission method and progression rate. Dr. Chen's analysis suggested that the infection could spread through bodily fluids, particularly saliva introduced through bite wounds. More alarming was the speed of transformation. Victims seemed to lose higher brain function within hours of infection while retaining basic motor skills and an overwhelming drive to attack uninfected individuals. Dr. Williams had begun coordinating with military medical units, suspecting that this outbreak could quickly overwhelm civilian medical resources. As evening approached, the scattered incidents began connecting into a terrifying pattern. Emergency services were reporting a dramatic increase in violent attacks across multiple neighborhoods. The attackers all displayed similar characteristics: pale skin, vacant eyes, and an apparent inability to feel pain or respond to verbal communication. Most disturbing was their single-minded focus on attacking uninfected humans, particularly targeting areas where people gathered in large numbers. Marcus found himself at the center of a crisis that was rapidly spiraling beyond normal law enforcement capabilities. Radio communications were becoming chaotic as units across the city reported similar incidents. The usual protocols for dealing with violent individuals were proving inadequate against attackers who seemed immune to standard crowd control methods. As darkness fell over Atlanta, Marcus realized that whatever was happening was far more serious than isolated criminal activity. They were facing something that threatened the very fabric of civilized society, and traditional responses were failing catastrophically. The emergency broadcast system crackled to life across Atlanta as the sun began to set, casting an ominous orange glow over the city. Mayor Robert Harrison stood before a hastily assembled press conference, his usually confident demeanor replaced by barely concealed anxiety. Behind him, emergency management officials whispered urgently into their phones while CDC representatives shuffled through stacks of preliminary reports. The mayor's voice carried across television screens throughout the metropolitan area as he announced a city-wide curfew, effective immediately, though he carefully avoided using words that might cause widespread panic. Detective Marcus Rodriguez had barely slept in 36 hours as reports continued flooding the police dispatch center. The attacks were no longer isolated incidents but were occurring in clusters throughout the city, with each new outbreak seeming to spawn additional cases within hours. Marcus had witnessed firsthand how quickly the situation was deteriorating when he responded to a call at Northside Shopping Mall. What had started as a single violent individual attacking shoppers had escalated into chaos as several victims of the initial attack began displaying the same aggressive, mindless behavior within the span of 2 hours. Dr. Emily Watson found herself effectively trapped within Mercy General Hospital as the medical facility transformed into a battlefield between the living and something that defied medical classification. The hospital's morgue had become a source of terror when bodies that had been pronounced dead began showing signs of movement. Security footage revealed the horrifying truth. Individuals who had succumbed to their injuries were reanimating with the same vacant, predatory behavior as the living infected. The hospital's backup generators hummed ominously as the main power grid began experiencing failures throughout the city. Jake Thompson's construction crew had managed to establish communication with other survivor groups using their work site's radio equipment. The reports they received painted a picture of a city under siege from an enemy that seemed to multiply with each encounter. Jake's military background from his service in Afghanistan had prepared him for combat situations, but this was unlike any enemy he had ever faced. These attackers felt no fear, showed no tactical thinking, and seemed driven by an insatiable hunger that made them relentlessly pursue any living human they encountered. At the CDC facility, Dr. Michael Chen was working with a skeleton crew as many of his colleagues had either fled the city or become unreachable. The laboratory analysis had revealed the pathogen's terrifying efficiency. It appeared to shut down higher brain functions while leaving the brainstem intact, creating beings driven purely by primitive impulses. Dr. Sarah Williams had established contact with military biocontainment units, but the response time for federal assistance was measured in days, not hours. The infection was spreading faster than any known disease, with a transmission rate that suggested the entire metropolitan area could be compromised within a week. The first major breach of organized defenses occurred at Atlanta International Airport when infected individuals overwhelmed security checkpoints during the evening rush. Travelers who had been attempting to flee the city found themselves trapped as the infection spread through the terminal buildings with devastating speed. Air traffic control reported multiple aircraft declaring emergencies as infected passengers attacked crew members mid-flight, forcing emergency landings at airports hundreds of miles away and effectively spreading the crisis beyond Atlanta's borders. Jennifer Martinez had barricaded herself and 12 students in the school's library after the elementary school became overrun during the afternoon. The children, ranging in age from 6 to 10, looked to her for protection and answers she didn't have. Through the library windows, she could see the playground where she had taught children to read and play, now occupied by shambling figures that had once been teachers and staff members. The school's intercom system occasionally crackled with automated emergency messages, but the building had otherwise fallen silent except for the persistent scratching and moaning from the corridors outside. Marcus found himself coordinating with National Guard units that had been deployed to establish safe zones throughout the city. The Georgia World Congress Center had been designated as a primary evacuation point, but the facility was quickly becoming overcrowded as thousands of refugees sought shelter. The military personnel were struggling to screen incoming civilians for signs of infection while maintaining perimeter security against increasingly large groups of infected individuals who seemed drawn to areas with high concentrations of uninfected humans. Dr. Watson had made the difficult decision to seal off entire sections of the hospital as the infection spread through the patient population. The pediatric ward had become a particular source of horror as infected children proved to be just as dangerous as adults, their small size allowing them to access areas that larger infected individuals could not reach. The hospital's staff was forced to make impossible choices about which patients could be saved and which areas had to be abandoned to prevent total facility compromise. The city's infrastructure began failing as infected individuals overwhelmed utility workers and emergency responders. Power outages rolled across neighborhoods in waves, while water treatment facilities went offline when their operators either fled or became infected. Cell phone towers became unreliable as maintenance crews abandoned their posts, leaving survivors increasingly isolated and unable to coordinate rescue efforts or share vital information about safe routes through the city. Jake's group had established contact with a former Marine named David Patterson who was organizing civilian resistance from a fortified position in an abandoned warehouse district. Patterson's military experience had taught him the importance of establishing supply lines and defensive positions, but he was adapting these principles to fight an enemy that required complete destruction to be stopped. The group was learning through trial and error that infected individuals could only be permanently stopped by severe trauma to the brain, a discovery that forced ordinary citizens to confront violence they had never imagined themselves capable of. As midnight approached, the scope of the crisis became undeniable. Emergency broadcasts from neighboring cities reported similar outbreaks, suggesting that the infection had already spread beyond Atlanta through various transportation networks. The federal government had begun implementing emergency protocols, but the response was hampered by the unprecedented nature of the threat and the rapid speed of its expansion. Survivors throughout the city were beginning to realize that help might not be coming, and that their survival would depend entirely on their ability to adapt to a world where the fundamental rules of human civilization no longer applied. Dawn broke over Atlanta to reveal a city transformed beyond recognition, its skyline punctuated by columns of black smoke rising from fires that burned unchecked throughout the metropolitan area. The morning light illuminated streets littered with abandoned vehicles, their doors hanging open where desperate drivers had fled on foot when traffic became impassable. Windows in office buildings and residential complexes had been shattered, either by fleeing survivors or by the infected who seemed drawn to any sign of human activity within. Detective Marcus Rodriguez stood on the roof of the police headquarters building, surveying the devastation through binoculars as he tried to establish radio contact with any remaining law enforcement units. The Georgia State Patrol had lost contact with most of their highway units during the night, and the Atlanta Police Department was operating with less than 20% of its normal personnel. Those officers who remained were either trapped in fortified positions throughout the city or had joined civilian survivor groups, abandoning their official duties in favor of basic survival. The Georgia World Congress Center, which had served as the primary evacuation point, had fallen during the early morning hours when infected individuals breached the hastily constructed barriers. The National Guard units defending the facility had been overwhelmed not by superior tactics or numbers, but by the relentless nature of an enemy that felt no fear and required complete destruction to be stopped. Survivors who escaped the facility's fall reported that the military personnel had fought bravely, but their training had not prepared them for combating an enemy that continued attacking even after sustaining wounds that would incapacitate or kill normal humans. Dr. Emily Watson found herself leading a group of medical personnel and patients through the hospital's underground maintenance tunnels as Mercy General Hospital became completely overrun. The infection had spread through the facility with devastating efficiency, turning patients and staff into mindless predators within hours of exposure. The hospital's emergency power systems continued functioning, creating an eerie atmosphere as automated announcements echoed through corridors now populated by shambling figures that had once been healers and patients seeking help. Jake Thompson's construction crew had joined forces with David Patterson's group, combining their industrial equipment with military expertise to create a fortified compound in the warehouse district. Their position offered strategic advantages, including multiple escape routes and access to heavy machinery that could be used as weapons against large groups of infected individuals. However, their supplies were limited, and the group was facing the harsh reality that their current location could only serve as a temporary refuge while they planned a more permanent survival strategy. At the CDC facility, Dr. Michael Chen was working frantically to complete his research before the building's defenses failed completely. The facility's security systems had been designed to contain biological hazards, not to keep out human attackers, and infected individuals were gathering in increasing numbers around the perimeter. Dr. Sarah Williams had managed to transmit their preliminary findings to federal authorities and international health organizations, but the data painted a grim picture of a pathogen that seemed almost engineered for maximum transmission and societal disruption. Jennifer Martinez had successfully evacuated her group of students from the elementary school during the pre-dawn hours, using her knowledge of the neighborhood to navigate through residential areas toward a community center that was reportedly serving as a safe zone. The children had shown remarkable resilience, following her instructions without question even as they witnessed horrors that would traumatize adults. However, their destination proved to be another false hope when they arrived to find the community center already overrun, forcing them to seek shelter in a nearby church. The interstate highway system around Atlanta had become a graveyard of abandoned vehicles stretching for miles in every direction. Survivors who had attempted to flee the city by car found themselves trapped in massive traffic jams when the infection spread to other motorists, creating chaos that brought all movement to a halt. Those who abandoned their vehicles and continued on foot faced the dual threats of infected individuals and exposure to the elements, as emergency services were no longer available to assist stranded travelers. Marcus received a final radio transmission from the mayor's office indicating that city government had ceased functioning as an organized entity. Mayor Harrison and most of his staff had either evacuated or become unreachable, leaving no central authority to coordinate emergency response efforts. The message instructed all remaining emergency personnel to focus on individual survival and to assist civilian groups when possible, effectively acknowledging that Atlanta had fallen beyond any hope of governmental restoration. The infection spread had accelerated beyond all projections, with entire neighborhoods becoming completely overrun within hours of the first reported cases. The pathogen seemed to thrive in densely populated areas, spreading through apartment complexes and office buildings with terrifying efficiency. Survivors reported that infected individuals displayed a form of pack behavior, gathering in large groups that moved through the city like a slow-moving tide of destruction, overwhelming any resistance through sheer numbers rather than tactical coordination. Dr. Watson's group had managed to reach the hospital's parking garage, where they discovered that most vehicles had been abandoned or damaged during the facility's fall. The few working vehicles they found were quickly loaded with medical supplies and equipment that might prove essential for treating injuries in a world without functioning hospitals. Their immediate goal was to reach other survivor groups and establish mobile medical support, though they had no clear destination or long-term plan for survival. Jake and David's combined group had established communication with other survivor enclaves throughout the city, creating an informal network of information sharing about safe routes, supply locations, and infected population movements. These communications revealed that the infection had spread far beyond Atlanta's borders, with similar outbreaks reported in major cities across the southeastern United States. The federal government's response appeared to be focused on containment rather than rescue, suggesting that survivors were truly on their own. The city's infrastructure continued its rapid collapse as automated systems failed without human maintenance and oversight. Water pressure dropped throughout the metropolitan area as pumping stations went offline, while natural gas leaks created additional fire hazards in neighborhoods already devastated by the outbreak. The electrical grid experienced cascading failures as power plants were abandoned, leaving vast sections of the city in darkness and making navigation increasingly dangerous for survivor groups. As the third day of the outbreak drew to a close, the transformation of Atlanta from a thriving metropolitan area to a post-apocalyptic wasteland was nearly complete. The infected population had grown exponentially, while the number of uninfected survivors had dwindled to scattered groups hiding in fortified positions throughout the urban landscape. Those who remained alive were beginning to understand that their old lives were gone forever, and that survival would require adapting to a new reality where human civilization had collapsed and been replaced by something far more primitive and dangerous. The fourth day brought with it a silence that was more terrifying than the chaos that had preceded it. Atlanta's once bustling streets now echoed only with the distant moans of the infected and the occasional crash of collapsing structures weakened by fire and neglect. The morning mist hung low over the city, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made it difficult to distinguish between shadows and the shambling figures that now dominated the urban landscape. Detective Marcus Rodriguez had abandoned the police headquarters after infected individuals finally breached the building's defenses during the night. He now found himself leading a group of 7 survivors, including 2 fellow officers and several civilians who had sought refuge at the station. Their supplies consisted of whatever they could carry from the building's emergency stores, along with weapons and ammunition that Marcus hoped would last long enough for them to reach a more secure location. The group moved carefully through side streets and alleyways, avoiding the main thoroughfares where large groups of infected individuals congregated. Dr. Emily Watson's medical team had established a temporary treatment facility in an abandoned veterinary clinic on the city's outskirts. The location provided them with basic medical equipment and pharmaceutical supplies, though they were forced to adapt veterinary medications for human use in many cases. Their patient load consisted primarily of bite victims who had not yet turned, though Watson was beginning to suspect that infection was inevitable regardless of treatment. The group had implemented strict quarantine protocols, but the emotional toll of watching patients transform into mindless predators was wearing heavily on the medical staff. Jake Thompson and David Patterson's combined group had grown to nearly 30 survivors as word of their fortified position spread through the survivor network. Their warehouse compound had been reinforced with construction equipment and military-grade barriers, creating what appeared to be the most secure location in the immediate area. However, the larger group size brought new challenges, including increased food consumption, personality conflicts, and the constant threat of attracting larger groups of infected individuals who seemed drawn to areas with high concentrations of human activity. Jennifer Martinez had successfully guided her group of students to a suburban elementary school that had been abandoned early in the outbreak. The facility provided them with a secure location and access to the school's emergency food supplies, though the children were struggling with the psychological trauma of their experiences. Jennifer found herself serving not only as their protector but also as their counselor and teacher, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy while preparing them for a world that bore no resemblance to the one they had known just days earlier. At the CDC facility, Dr. Michael Chen had made a breakthrough in understanding the pathogen's behavior, though his findings offered little hope for a cure or treatment. The organism appeared to be a hybrid creation that combined characteristics of multiple known pathogens while displaying properties that seemed almost artificially enhanced. Dr. Sarah Williams had managed to establish satellite communication with international research facilities, sharing their data with scientists around the world who were reporting similar outbreaks in major population centers across multiple continents. The infected population had begun displaying new behavioral patterns that suggested a form of evolutionary adaptation. Groups of infected individuals were moving in coordinated formations, almost like hunting packs, and they seemed to be developing primitive problem-solving abilities that allowed them to overcome simple barriers and obstacles. Some survivors reported that infected individuals were using basic tools such as rocks and sticks to break through windows and doors, indicating that some level of cognitive function remained despite the apparent loss of higher reasoning abilities. Marcus's group encountered their first major challenge when they attempted to cross a bridge over the Chattahoochee River, only to discover that the structure had become a bottleneck where hundreds of infected individuals had gathered. The bridge's narrow confines made it impossible to fight through the crowd, forcing the group to seek an alternative route that would add days to their journey. The delay meant consuming precious supplies while searching for another crossing point, and Marcus was beginning to question whether their destination would prove any safer than their current location. Dr. Watson's medical facility faced a crisis when one of their quarantined patients transformed during the night, attacking and infecting 2 staff members before being subdued. The incident forced the group to implement even stricter security measures, including the difficult decision to immediately isolate anyone showing early symptoms of infection. The emotional burden of essentially condemning infected individuals to death was taking a severe toll on the medical team, who had dedicated their careers to saving lives rather than ending them. The warehouse compound had become a beacon for survivors throughout the region, but this success brought unexpected dangers. Jake and David discovered that their radio communications were being monitored by hostile groups of survivors who had turned to raiding and violence as their primary survival strategy. These groups, led by individuals who had embraced the collapse of civilization as an opportunity for personal gain, posed a threat that was potentially more dangerous than the infected population because they retained human intelligence and tactical thinking abilities. Jennifer's group faced their own challenges when several of the children began showing signs of severe psychological trauma, including nightmares, withdrawal, and aggressive behavior that made group cohesion difficult to maintain. The school's library had become their primary living space, but the children's educational books and familiar surroundings served as constant reminders of the world they had lost. Jennifer struggled to balance the need for maintaining hope and normalcy with the harsh reality that their survival depended on adapting to a fundamentally changed world. The CDC team made a disturbing discovery when they analyzed tissue samples from recently transformed individuals. The pathogen appeared to be mutating at an accelerated rate, with each new generation showing increased resistance to environmental factors and improved efficiency in neural system takeover. Dr. Chen's projections suggested that the organism would continue evolving, potentially developing new transmission methods or enhanced survival capabilities that would make it even more difficult to combat. Communication between survivor groups revealed that the infection had spread globally, with major cities on every continent reporting similar outbreaks. International borders had been closed, air travel had ceased, and maritime shipping had been suspended as governments attempted to contain the spread. However, these measures appeared to be too little and too late, as the pathogen had already established footholds in population centers worldwide before its existence was even recognized by health authorities. As the fourth day concluded, survivor groups throughout Atlanta were beginning to understand that their situation was not temporary and that rescue was not coming. The federal government's response had shifted from containment to damage control, with military units establishing quarantine zones around major population centers rather than attempting rescue operations. Survivors were forced to confront the reality that they were living in a new world where the rules of civilization no longer applied, and where their continued existence depended entirely on their ability to adapt, fight, and make impossible choices in the face of an enemy that had once been their neighbors, friends, and family members. The fifth day dawned gray and cold, with autumn winds carrying the acrid smell of smoke and decay across what remained of Atlanta. The city had become a monument to humanity's fragility, its abandoned skyscrapers standing like tombstones against a sky that seemed perpetually overcast. Nature was already beginning to reclaim the urban landscape, with weeds pushing through cracks in sidewalks and vines starting to climb the walls of buildings that would never again house human occupants. Detective Marcus Rodriguez sat in the ruins of a gas station, carefully rationing the last of their water while his group rested during the dangerous daylight hours. They had learned that infected individuals were more active during the day, possibly drawn by visual stimuli, making travel safer under cover of darkness. The group had lost 2 members during their attempted river crossing when a hidden group of infected had emerged from a drainage culvert, overwhelming their rear guard before anyone could react. Marcus found himself questioning every decision, knowing that a single mistake could doom the remaining survivors who looked to him for leadership. The loss of Officer Janet Williams had hit the group particularly hard, not just because of her tactical expertise, but because she had been the one maintaining their radio equipment and communication with other survivor groups. Her death had effectively cut them off from the informal network that had provided crucial information about safe routes and supply locations. Marcus now faced the challenge of navigating through hostile territory without the intelligence that had kept them alive, relying instead on his instincts and the increasingly unreliable advice of civilian group members who were struggling with their own trauma and fear. Dr. Emily Watson's medical facility had been forced to relocate after infected individuals discovered their location and began gathering in increasing numbers around the veterinary clinic. The move had cost them most of their medical supplies and equipment, leaving Watson with little more than basic first aid materials and a handful of antibiotics that would soon expire. More devastating was the loss of 3 patients who had been too weak to travel, forcing the medical team to make the agonizing decision to leave them behind with enough medication to ensure a peaceful death rather than transformation. The psychological toll on Watson's team was becoming as dangerous as their physical circumstances. Dr. Robert Kim, a surgeon who had worked alongside Watson for years, had begun showing signs of severe depression and had twice attempted to expose himself to infected individuals in what appeared to be suicide attempts. The team was forced to maintain constant surveillance over their own members while continuing to provide medical care to new survivors who arrived with increasingly severe injuries and trauma. Jake Thompson's warehouse compound had evolved into a small military installation, complete with guard towers constructed from construction equipment and defensive barriers that could withstand assault from large groups of infected individuals. However, the compound's success had attracted the attention of a hostile survivor group led by a former prison inmate named Vincent Torres, who had organized other criminals and desperate individuals into a raiding party that targeted established survivor communities. Torres's group had been conducting psychological warfare against the warehouse compound, using loudspeakers to broadcast threats and disturbing messages during the night hours when the defenders were most vulnerable to fear and paranoia. The raiders had also been leaving mutilated bodies of captured survivors near the compound's perimeter, creating a horrific display designed to demoralize the defenders and encourage surrender. David Patterson's military training had prepared him for conventional warfare, but the psychological tactics employed by Torres's group were testing the mental resilience of even the most hardened survivors. Jennifer Martinez faced her greatest challenge yet when 8-year-old Tommy Richardson began showing early symptoms of infection after being scratched by an infected individual during their escape from the community center. The child's transformation was progressing slowly, giving Jennifer time to prepare the other children for the inevitable loss of their friend. The decision of what to do with Tommy created a moral crisis that threatened to tear the group apart, with some children begging to stay with their friend while others demanded that he be isolated immediately. The emotional burden of potentially having to end Tommy's life before he could transform and threaten the other children was pushing Jennifer to her psychological breaking point. She had never imagined that her role as a teacher would require making life-and-death decisions about the children in her care. The other students looked to her for guidance and protection, but she felt increasingly inadequate to provide either in a world where traditional moral frameworks no longer seemed to apply. At the CDC facility, Dr. Michael Chen had made a discovery that fundamentally changed their understanding of the outbreak's origins. Analysis of the pathogen's genetic structure revealed artificial markers that suggested laboratory creation rather than natural evolution. The organism appeared to have been engineered with specific characteristics designed to maximize transmission and minimize the possibility of developing natural immunity. Dr. Sarah Williams had attempted to share this information with international authorities, but communication networks had become so unreliable that she could not confirm whether the data had been received. The implications of Chen's discovery were staggering, suggesting that the outbreak was not a natural disaster but an act of biological warfare or terrorism on a global scale. The pathogen's sophisticated design indicated access to advanced biotechnology and extensive knowledge of human physiology, pointing to either a state-sponsored program or a well-funded terrorist organization with significant scientific resources. This revelation added a new dimension of horror to their situation, as it meant that someone had deliberately unleashed this catastrophe upon humanity. Communication intercepts from military frequencies revealed that the federal government had implemented martial law in unaffected regions and was establishing quarantine zones with orders to shoot anyone attempting to leave infected areas. The military's primary concern appeared to be preventing the spread of infection rather than rescuing survivors, effectively writing off entire metropolitan areas as acceptable losses in the fight to preserve uninfected populations. Marcus's group discovered evidence of the government's abandonment policy when they encountered a military checkpoint that had been hastily abandoned, leaving behind equipment and supplies but no personnel. Documents found at the site indicated that military units had been ordered to withdraw to defensive positions around major government installations, abandoning civilian populations to their fate. The realization that they were truly on their own was devastating to group morale and forced Marcus to confront the possibility that survival might require abandoning traditional concepts of law, order, and moral behavior. The warehouse compound faced its first major assault when Torres's raiding party launched a coordinated attack using stolen military equipment and tactics learned from former soldiers within their ranks. The battle lasted throughout the night, with the defenders managing to repel the assault but suffering significant casualties in the process. Jake Thompson was severely wounded while operating a piece of construction equipment as a weapon, leaving David Patterson to assume full leadership of the compound's defense while dealing with his own injuries and exhaustion. Dr. Watson's group encountered a family of survivors who had been living in a suburban home for the past week, apparently unaware of the true scope of the outbreak. The family's isolation had protected them from infection but had also left them completely unprepared for the reality of their situation. When infected individuals finally discovered their location, the family's lack of preparation and defensive measures resulted in a massacre that Watson's team was powerless to prevent, arriving only in time to witness the final moments of the attack. As the fifth day ended, survivor groups throughout the region were beginning to understand that their struggle was not just against the infected population, but against the complete breakdown of human civilization and the moral frameworks that had previously governed their behavior. The choices they faced were becoming increasingly difficult, forcing ordinary people to commit acts of violence and make decisions that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. The true cost of survival was proving to be not just physical, but psychological and moral, as the fight for life required abandoning many of the principles that had previously defined their humanity. The sixth day brought an unexpected development that would reshape the dynamics of survival in the Atlanta wasteland. A massive thunderstorm had rolled through during the night, washing away much of the smoke and haze that had blanketed the city while also driving both survivors and infected individuals to seek shelter. The storm's aftermath revealed a landscape transformed once again, with flooded streets creating new barriers and opportunities for those still fighting to stay alive. Detective Marcus Rodriguez's group had taken refuge in an abandoned shopping mall during the storm, discovering that they were not alone in seeking shelter from the elements. 3 other survivor groups had independently chosen the same location, creating an unexpected gathering of nearly 40 people in the mall's central court area. The initial tension between the groups gradually gave way to cautious cooperation as they realized that their combined resources and skills offered better prospects for survival than continued isolation. Among the new arrivals was Dr. Lisa Chen, a psychiatrist who had been working with a group of survivors from a nearby nursing home. Her expertise in human behavior and crisis management proved invaluable in mediating disputes between the different groups and helping establish protocols for their temporary alliance. Dr. Chen had witnessed firsthand how quickly civilized people could descend into barbarism when faced with extreme circumstances, and she worked tirelessly to maintain some semblance of social order within their makeshift community. The mall's layout provided natural defensive advantages, with multiple levels and choke points that could be easily defended against infected attackers. More importantly, the building's stores contained supplies that had been largely untouched during the initial chaos of the outbreak. The groups worked together to inventory their resources, discovering enough food, water, and medical supplies to sustain their enlarged community for several weeks if carefully rationed. Dr. Emily Watson's medical team had finally established contact with Jake Thompson's warehouse compound through a ham radio operator named Frank Morrison, who had been maintaining communication networks between survivor groups throughout the region. Morrison's radio equipment had survived the storm, and he was able to coordinate a meeting between Watson's medical team and the warehouse defenders. The prospect of combining medical expertise with military-style defenses offered hope for creating a more permanent and secure settlement. The journey to the warehouse compound proved treacherous, as the storm had altered the landscape and created new hazards for travelers. Flooded areas had become breeding grounds for waterborne diseases, while collapsed buildings and downed power lines created additional obstacles. Watson's team was forced to take a circuitous route that added days to their travel time, during which they encountered evidence of other survivor groups that had not been as fortunate in weathering the storm. Jennifer Martinez had made the heartbreaking decision to end Tommy Richardson's suffering before his transformation could endanger the other children. The 8-year-old had deteriorated rapidly during the storm, and Jennifer recognized that waiting any longer would put the entire group at risk. The act of mercy, killing a child under her protection, fundamentally changed Jennifer's understanding of her role and responsibilities, forcing her to accept that survival sometimes required making choices that violated every instinct and moral principle she had previously held sacred. The psychological impact of Tommy's death rippled through the group of children, with some understanding the necessity of Jennifer's actions while others struggled to comprehend why their teacher had hurt their friend. Jennifer found herself serving as both protector and counselor, trying to help the children process their trauma while maintaining the discipline and unity necessary for their continued survival. The experience taught her that leadership in their new world required a hardness that she had never possessed as an educator in the old world. At the CDC facility, Dr. Michael Chen had been working with Dr. Sarah Williams to develop a theoretical framework for combating the pathogen, despite their limited resources and equipment. Their research had revealed that the organism's artificial nature might also be its weakness, as engineered biological systems often contain built-in limitations designed to prevent uncontrolled evolution. However, exploiting these potential weaknesses would require laboratory facilities and resources that were no longer available to them. The CDC team had also discovered evidence suggesting that the outbreak had been coordinated across multiple locations simultaneously, indicating a level of planning and organization that pointed to a sophisticated terrorist network or rogue state actor. Intercepted communications fragments suggested that similar facilities in other countries had been compromised at approximately the same time, supporting the theory that the outbreak was part of a coordinated global attack rather than an accidental release. Jake Thompson's recovery from his injuries had been slower than expected, leaving David Patterson to manage both the compound's defenses and the integration of new survivor groups that continued to arrive seeking shelter. Patterson's military background had prepared him for tactical challenges, but the administrative and diplomatic aspects of leading a growing community tested skills he had never fully developed. The compound's success was attracting attention from both friendly and hostile groups, requiring constant vigilance and careful resource management. The arrival of Dr. Watson's medical team at the warehouse compound marked a turning point in the community's development from a temporary refuge to a permanent settlement. Watson's expertise allowed them to establish proper medical facilities and implement health protocols that reduced the risk of disease outbreaks within their population. More importantly, her presence provided psychological comfort to community members who had been living with the constant fear of injury or illness in a world without functioning hospitals. Vincent Torres's raiding group had been significantly weakened by the storm, which had destroyed their temporary camps and scattered their forces across the region. However, Torres himself had survived and was reportedly attempting to rebuild his organization by recruiting from the growing population of desperate survivors who had lost their own groups during the storm. Intelligence gathered by Patterson's scouts suggested that Torres was planning a larger assault on the warehouse compound, possibly in coordination with other hostile groups that had emerged in the post-storm landscape. The mall community had established contact with both the warehouse compound and several other survivor settlements, creating an informal network of allied groups that shared information and resources. This network represented the first step toward rebuilding some form of organized society, though the challenges of maintaining cooperation between groups with different leadership styles and survival philosophies remained significant. Marcus Rodriguez had emerged as the de facto leader of the mall community, his law enforcement background providing the authority and decision-making skills necessary to coordinate between the different groups. However, he was acutely aware that his leadership was based on consent rather than legal authority, and that maintaining unity would require constant negotiation and compromise. The community had established basic rules and procedures for resource allocation, security duties, and conflict resolution, creating the foundation for a more structured society. Dr. Chen's psychiatric expertise had proven invaluable in helping community members cope with the trauma and stress of their situation. She had established regular counseling sessions and group therapy meetings that provided emotional support while also serving as early warning systems for individuals who might be developing dangerous psychological conditions. Her work was crucial in preventing the kind of mental breakdowns that could threaten the entire community's stability and survival. As the sixth day concluded, the various survivor communities were beginning to understand that their long-term survival would depend not just on fighting off infected individuals and hostile raiders, but on their ability to rebuild the social structures and cooperative relationships that had been the foundation of human civilization. The storm had provided both challenges and opportunities, forcing groups to work together while also revealing the potential for creating something new from the ruins of the old world. The seventh day arrived with an ominous stillness that experienced survivors had learned to recognize as the calm before a storm of violence. Intelligence gathered through the radio network indicated that Vincent Torres had succeeded in uniting several raider groups under his leadership, creating a force of nearly 200 desperate and violent individuals who had chosen predation over cooperation as their survival strategy. Their target was the warehouse compound, which had become a symbol of successful resistance and organized survival in the post-outbreak world. Detective Marcus Rodriguez received the warning through Frank Morrison's radio network and immediately began coordinating with the mall community to provide support for the warehouse compound's defense. The mall's strategic location and resources made it a valuable staging area for reinforcements, but the distance between the two settlements meant that any assistance would need to be carefully planned and executed. Rodriguez found himself making tactical decisions that would have been unthinkable during his law enforcement career, including the authorization of lethal force against human targets who posed a threat to their community. Dr. Emily Watson had established a field hospital within the warehouse compound, preparing for the casualties that would inevitably result from the coming battle. Her medical team had been training compound residents in basic first aid and trauma care, knowing that the limited number of medical professionals would be overwhelmed if the fighting became intense. Watson had also been working with Dr. Lisa Chen to prepare psychological support for survivors who would be forced to kill other human beings for the first time, understanding that the mental trauma of such actions could be as devastating as physical injuries. David Patterson had transformed the warehouse compound into a fortress, using construction equipment and military tactics to create defensive positions that could withstand assault from a much larger force. The compound's residents had been organized into defensive units based on their skills and experience, with former military personnel serving as squad leaders while civilians provided support roles. Patterson's biggest challenge was maintaining morale among defenders who understood that they were facing overwhelming odds with no possibility of retreat or reinforcement. Jennifer Martinez had made the difficult decision to evacuate her group of children from the suburban school to the warehouse compound, recognizing that the coming battle would likely spill over into surrounding areas. The journey required traveling through territory that had become increasingly dangerous as raider groups moved into position for their assault. Jennifer's group was escorted by a team of volunteers from the mall community, led by Rodriguez himself, who understood that protecting the children had become a symbol of their commitment to preserving humanity's future. The evacuation convoy encountered its first challenge when they discovered that Torres's raiders had established roadblocks on the main routes leading to the warehouse compound. These checkpoints were manned by heavily armed individuals who showed no hesitation in attacking anyone attempting to pass through their territory. Rodriguez's team was forced to engage in running firefights while protecting the children, an experience that tested everyone's resolve and demonstrated the brutal reality of their new world. At the CDC facility, Dr. Michael Chen had made a breakthrough that could potentially change the course of the conflict, though implementing his discovery would require resources and time that might not be available. His analysis of the pathogen had revealed a potential weakness in its genetic structure that could be exploited to create a targeted biological agent. However, producing such an agent would require laboratory equipment and materials that were no longer accessible, making his discovery more of a theoretical possibility than a practical solution. Dr. Sarah Williams had been working to establish communication with international research facilities, hoping to share Chen's findings with scientists who might have the resources to develop a countermeasure. However, the global nature of the outbreak had disrupted most international communication networks, and the few contacts she had been able to reach reported similar conditions in their own regions. The realization that the entire world was facing the same crisis eliminated any hope of external assistance or rescue. The warehouse compound's defenders received an unexpected boost when a group of former National Guard soldiers arrived seeking shelter, bringing with them military-grade weapons and equipment that had been abandoned during the government's withdrawal from the region. These soldiers, led by Sergeant Maria Santos, had been attempting to reach their families when they learned of the compound's existence through the radio network. Their arrival provided Patterson with experienced personnel and firepower that significantly improved the compound's defensive capabilities. Torres's raiding force had grown beyond initial estimates, incorporating not just criminals and desperate survivors but also individuals who had been driven to madness by their experiences during the outbreak. These mentally unstable raiders were often the most dangerous opponents, as they showed no regard for their own safety and were willing to engage in suicidal attacks that could breach defensive positions. Patterson's intelligence network reported that Torres was using these individuals as shock troops, sending them in first waves to exhaust the defenders' ammunition and reveal their defensive positions. The mall community had organized a relief force to assist the warehouse compound, but their departure was delayed when infected individuals launched a coordinated assault on the shopping center. The attack appeared to be more organized than previous encounters with infected populations, suggesting that the pathogen was continuing to evolve and that infected individuals were developing more sophisticated behavioral patterns. The mall's defenders were forced to fight a desperate battle to maintain their position while preparing to send aid to their allies. Jennifer's convoy finally reached the warehouse compound after a harrowing journey that had cost them 2 escort vehicles and several volunteers who had sacrificed themselves to ensure the children's safety. The arrival of the children at the compound created both hope and additional pressure for the defenders, who now understood that failure would mean not just their own deaths but the loss of innocents who represented the future of human civilization. Dr. Watson's medical preparations were put to the test when advanced elements of Torres's force began probing the compound's defenses, resulting in the first casualties of what would become a prolonged siege. The wounded included both defenders and captured raiders, creating ethical dilemmas about providing medical care to enemies who had been attempting to kill them. Watson made the decision to treat all wounded individuals regardless of their affiliation, maintaining her medical oath even in circumstances that challenged every principle of her profession. The compound's radio operators intercepted communications indicating that Torres's force was planning a multi-pronged assault designed to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers and sustained pressure. The attack would begin with artillery bombardment using improvised explosives, followed by coordinated ground assaults from multiple directions. Patterson's defensive plan relied on channeling the attackers into predetermined kill zones while maintaining escape routes for non-combatants, but the success of this strategy would depend on the defenders' ability to maintain discipline under extreme pressure. As night fell on the 7th day, both sides prepared for a battle that would determine not just the fate of the warehouse compound but the future of organized resistance in the Atlanta region. The defenders understood that their victory would demonstrate that cooperation and civilization could survive even in the post-outbreak world, while defeat would likely lead to the collapse of the entire survivor network and the triumph of chaos over order. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test every lesson learned during their week of survival and determine whether humanity's better nature could prevail over its darkest impulses. The 8th day began before sunrise with the thunderous roar of improvised explosives detonating against the warehouse compound's outer defenses. Vincent Torres had launched his assault under cover of darkness, sending waves of desperate raiders against the fortified positions that David Patterson's team had spent days preparing. The battle that followed would become legendary among the scattered survivor communities, marking the moment when humanity's future hung in the balance between civilization and chaos. Detective Marcus Rodriguez led the relief force from the mall community in a desperate race to reach the warehouse compound before the defenses could be overwhelmed. His convoy of armored vehicles and armed volunteers fought through multiple raider checkpoints, leaving a trail of destruction across the Atlanta wasteland. The sound of gunfire and explosions from the compound grew louder as they approached, indicating that the battle had reached a critical intensity that would determine the outcome within hours. Dr. Emily Watson worked frantically in her makeshift field hospital as casualties poured in from the defensive lines. The medical facility had been established in the compound's most secure area, but even there the sounds of battle were deafening and the building shook with each explosion. Watson found herself performing emergency surgery under combat conditions, making life-and-death decisions with limited supplies while knowing that the compound's fall would mean death for everyone inside, including the wounded she was trying to save. David Patterson coordinated the defense from a command post constructed atop the warehouse's highest building, using radio communications to direct his scattered units while personally engaging enemy forces with a sniper rifle. His military training had prepared him for combat, but the intensity and duration of this battle tested every limit of his endurance and tactical knowledge. The raiders' willingness to accept massive casualties in exchange for small territorial gains created a grinding war of attrition that favored the larger attacking force. Jennifer Martinez had taken the children to the compound's deepest shelter, a reinforced basement area that had been designated as the final fallback position. The children huddled together in the darkness, listening to the sounds of battle above while Jennifer tried to maintain their courage with stories and songs that seemed absurdly inadequate given their circumstances. She had armed herself with a pistol, knowing that if the defenses failed, she would face the impossible choice of allowing the children to be captured or ending their lives to spare them from a worse fate. The turning point came when Sergeant Maria Santos led a counterattack that broke through the raiders' eastern assault line, creating confusion in their ranks and allowing Patterson's forces to regain lost ground. Santos had recognized that Torres's strategy relied on maintaining pressure from multiple directions simultaneously, and that disrupting one axis of attack would create opportunities to defeat the others in detail. Her bold action inspired the other defenders and demonstrated that the raiders could be beaten despite their numerical advantage. Torres himself had positioned his command post in an abandoned office building overlooking the compound, directing his forces through radio communications while remaining safely distant from the actual fighting. His strategy had been to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers, but he had underestimated both their tactical skill and their determination to protect what they had built. As his assault waves were repeatedly repelled with heavy casualties, Torres began to realize that his grand plan for conquest was failing. The arrival of Rodriguez's relief force created chaos in the raiders' rear areas, forcing Torres to divert significant numbers of his fighters to deal with this new threat. The two-front battle stretched the raiders' resources beyond their breaking point, as they lacked the coordination and discipline necessary to fight a complex engagement against multiple opponents. Rodriguez's forces fought with the desperation of people who understood that defeat would mean the end of everything they had worked to preserve. Dr. Michael Chen had remained at the CDC facility throughout the battle, working frantically to complete his research on the pathogen's weaknesses. His breakthrough came when he realized that the organism's artificial nature made it vulnerable to specific electromagnetic frequencies that could disrupt its cellular structure. Using the facility's emergency broadcast equipment, Chen began transmitting these frequencies across the region, hoping to weaken the infected population and provide some advantage to the human survivors. The electromagnetic transmission had an unexpected effect on the infected individuals in the area, causing them to become disoriented and less aggressive. This change was noticed first by the compound's perimeter guards, who reported that infected individuals who had been gathering around the battle site were now wandering aimlessly or collapsing entirely. The discovery that the pathogen could be countered, even temporarily, provided hope that a permanent solution might eventually be developed. Dr. Sarah Williams had been monitoring international communications throughout the battle, and she began receiving reports that similar electromagnetic treatments were showing success in other parts of the world. Research facilities that had survived the initial outbreak were beginning to coordinate their efforts, sharing information and resources in a global attempt to develop countermeasures against the pathogen. The realization that humanity was fighting back on multiple fronts provided psychological encouragement to the embattled survivors. The battle reached its climax when Torres personally led a final assault against the compound's main gate, hoping to break through the defenses before his remaining forces lost the will to continue fighting. The attack was met by Patterson himself, leading a desperate countercharge that turned into hand-to-hand combat in the compound's outer courtyard. The fighting was brutal and personal, with both sides understanding that this moment would determine the outcome of the entire conflict. Torres fell during the melee, struck down by Patterson in a confrontation that had become symbolic of the larger struggle between order and chaos. The Raider leader's death broke the morale of his remaining forces, who began retreating in disorder as their command structure collapsed. The compound's defenders pursued the fleeing Raiders, ensuring that they would not be able to regroup and launch another assault. Jennifer emerged from the shelter with the children as the sounds of battle faded, finding a compound that had been transformed by the night's fighting but had ultimately survived. The cost had been enormous, with nearly half of the defenders killed or wounded, but their victory had demonstrated that organized communities could defend themselves against both infected threats and human predators. The children's survival represented hope for the future, proof that civilization could endure even in the darkest circumstances. Dr. Watson's medical team worked through the morning treating the wounded from both sides, as the compound's leadership had decided to provide care for captured raiders who were willing to abandon their violent ways. This decision reflected a commitment to maintaining humanitarian principles even in the post-outbreak world, establishing precedents for how survivor communities would interact with each other in the future. The radio network carried news of the compound's victory to survivor communities throughout the region, inspiring other groups to organize their own defenses and begin working toward larger cooperative arrangements. The battle had proven that coordination and mutual support could overcome seemingly impossible odds, providing a model for rebuilding civilization from the scattered remnants of the old world. As the 8th day drew to a close, the survivors began the long process of rebuilding and expansion. Dr. Chen's electromagnetic treatment had provided a temporary reprieve from the infected threat, giving communities time to establish more permanent defenses and develop long-term survival strategies. The warehouse compound had become the nucleus of a growing network of allied settlements, each contributing resources and expertise to their collective survival. The children who had survived the week-long ordeal would grow up in a world fundamentally different from the one their parents had known, but they would also inherit the knowledge and determination that had made survival possible. Jennifer Martinez had evolved from a teacher protecting her students to a leader helping to shape the next generation of humanity, understanding that education and hope were as important as weapons and walls in the fight for civilization's future. The dawn of the new world had arrived not with the restoration of the old order, but with the creation of something entirely different. The survivors had learned that humanity's greatest strength lay not in its technology or institutions, but in its capacity for cooperation, sacrifice, and adaptation in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. The battle for Atlanta was over, but the larger struggle to rebuild human civilization had only just begun.